The machine gun opened fire at 0347 hours on November 8, 1943, and what came out of that single emplacement was impossible. 3 streams of tracer fire arced across the darkness, converging and separating in a braided pattern that looked like something from hell's own loom. The Japanese assault wave, 200 men charging across open ground toward the American offensive line on Bougainville, simply ceased to exist. Bodies fell in rows, cut down by intersecting field of fire that left no gaps, no safe angles, no possibility of survival. The sound wasn't the familiar hammering of a Browning M2. It was deeper, heavier, a continuous roar like tearing metal that didn't pause or cycle or give any indication that a human being controlled it. Lieutenant Yamada Kenji, leading the second wave and still 30 yards behind the first, threw himself flat and pressed his face into the mud. Around him, men screamed and died. Above him, the 3 streams of fire continued their geometric dance, tracers painting patterns against the jungle canopy. Yamada had fought since Manchuria in 1937. He'd seen every weapon the Americans deployed, from carbines to flamethrowers. But this was different. This was something new, something that violated his understanding of how machine guns worked. 3 guns, he thought. They positioned 3 guns so close together that they sound like one. But when dawn came and he crawled back to the killing field to Japanese lines, when intelligence officers interrogated survivors and examined the evidence, they realized the truth was worse. It hadn't been 3 guns. It had been 1 gun with 3 barrels, firing simultaneously, operated by a single gunner. The Americans had created a monster. The Browning M2 heavy machine gun was already one of the most effective weapons of World War II by late 1943. Designed by John Browning the years following World War I and adopted by the U.S. military in 1933, the M2 fired the .50 caliber BMG cartridge, a round powerful enough to penetrate light armor, destroy vehicles, and engage aircraft. The weapon's effective range exceeded a mile, and its rate of fire of 450 to 600 rounds per minute made it devastating against infantry and soft targets. American forces deployed M2S in every theater, mounting them on vehicles, ships, aircraft, and in static defensive positions. The weapon was reliable, powerful, and respected by both users and enemies, but it had limitations. The sustained rate of fire was constrained by barrel heating. After approximately 150 rounds of continuous fire, the barrel would become hot enough to affect accuracy and potentially cause malfunctions. Standard doctrine called for firing in bursts of 6 to 9 rounds to manage heat and conserve ammunition. Crew-served operation required at least 2 men, 1 to fire and 1 to feed ammunition, and assist with barrel changes when necessary. And despite its power, a single M2 could only cover a limited arc of fire at any given moment. Attacking forces that dispersed widely or assaulted from multiple directions could potentially overwhelm a position defended by a single heavy machine gun. These limitations became acute in the Pacific Theater, where Japanese infantry tactics emphasized mass assaults, often at night, with hundreds of soldiers attacking in waves designed to absorb defensive fire and overwhelm positions through sheer numbers. American defensive lines would be hit by banzai charges, suicidal attacks in which Japanese soldiers advanced directly into fire, accepting catastrophic casualties in the hope that some percentage would reach American lines and engage in close combat, where Japanese skill with bayonets and swords could be decisive. Machine guns were critical in breaking these charges, but even the powerful M2 could only fire in one direction at a time. A skilled gunner could traverse the weapon left and right, hosing down attackers across a wide front. But there would always be moments when a gun was pointed away from some section of the assault, giving attackers in that sector precious seconds to advance. Multiple machine guns covering overlapping fields of fire were the standard solution, but this required more crews, more weapons, and more ammunition supply. And on small islands with limited manpower and supplies, every weapon and every soldier counted. The innovation came from a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant named Robert Chen, a first-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco who had enlisted in 1938 and served in Pacific since Guadalcanal. Chen was a gifted improviser, the kind of soldier who understood weapons at a deep mechanical level and wasn't afraid to modify equipment if he thought it would work better. He'd already gained a reputation in his battalion for customizing rifles, adjusting triggers, and fabricating parts from scrap metal when official supply channels failed. In October 1943, during the preparation for Bougainville invasion, Chen's company was tasked with defending a sector that intelligence suggested would face heavy assault. The defensive line was stretched thin, and Chen's machine gun position was expected to cover nearly 200 yards of front, an impossible task for a single weapon. Chen spent 3 days examining the problem, studying the terrain, calculating fields of fire, and considering solutions. The answer he arrived at was mechanically simple but tactically radical. If one M2 barrel could deliver devastating fire in one direction, why not mount 3 barrels together? Synchronize the fire simultaneously, creating a weapon that could put 3 times the firepower into the same target area in the same amount of time? The engineering challenge was significant but not insurmountable. Chen needed 3 M2 barrels, 3 bolt assemblies, 3 feeding mechanisms, and a frame that could mount all 3 weapons close enough together that a single gunner could control them while keeping the barrels parallel, so the fire would converge at a target distance. He also needed a way to synchronize the triggers, so one press would fire all 3 weapons simultaneously. Chen scavenged parts from damaged M2S that had been written off and stripped for spare parts. He fabricated a mounting frame from steel plates originally intended for vehicle armor repair, drilling and welding through 3 nights in a battalion workshop, while other Marines brought him coffee and watched in fascination. The trigger linkage was the trickiest part, a mechanical system using steel cable and lever arms that connected all 3 trigger mechanisms to a single firing control. When the gunner pressed a main trigger, all 3 cables would pull simultaneously, releasing all 3 bolts and firing all 3 weapons. The ammunition feeds were standard M2 belt systems, 1 for each barrel, which meant the weapon required 3 assistants to keep the belts running smoothly and prevent jams. The completed assembly weighed approximately 280 pounds, nearly 3 times the weight of a single M2, and it required a reinforced mount to handle combined recoil of 3 weapons firing simultaneously. Chen test-fired the weapon on November 6th, 2 days before the expected Japanese assault, using a sandbag emplacement on the edge of the perimeter. The results exceeded his hopes. The 3 barrels, spaced approximately 8 inches apart and angled to converge at 100 yards, created a cone of fire that was effectively impossible to evade. The combined rate of fire was roughly 1,500 rounds per minute, emptying 3 100-round belts in less than 15 seconds. The tracers, loaded every 5th round per standard practice, created a visual effect that looked like a solid stream of light rather than individual bullets. The impact on targets, tested against coconut logs and abandoned Japanese equipment, was catastrophic. Where a single M2 would tear through wood and metal over the course of several seconds, the triple-barrel version obliterated targets almost instantly, the concentrated fire shattering structures and shredding anything in the cone of impact. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous mechanical roar that was felt as much as heard, the combined muzzle blast creating a pressure wave that rippled through the air. Chen's commanding officer, Captain William Thornton, observed the test firing and immediately recognized the weapon's potential. He also recognized the risks. The weapon was untested in combat. It consumed ammunition at a rate that could deplete stocks quickly, and there was no way to know if the improvised mounting frame would hold up under sustained firing. But Thornton also knew that his company was undermanned and overextended, and that Japanese forces on Bougainville had already demonstrated a willingness to launch massive night attacks against American positions. The decision was made to deploy the weapon, position it at the center of the expected assault axis, and give Chen and his hand-picked crew the mission of breaking the first attack wave. The Japanese assault came at 0347 hours, exactly as predicted by intelligence officers who had intercepted radio traffic and observed enemy troop movements. The attack was preceded by a brief mortar barrage, shells falling randomly across the American line in an attempt to suppress defenses and create confusion. Then came the human wave. 200 men of the Japanese 23rd Infantry Regiment, advancing at a run with bayonets fixed and officers shouting encouragement. The attackers had approximately 300 yards of open ground to cross, former plantation land that had been cleared and provided no cover. Under normal circumstances, this would be a killing field for American machine guns and rifles, but the Japanese commanders were gambling that darkness, speed, and overwhelming numbers would carry the attack through. They'd used this tactic successfully elsewhere in the Pacific, accepting 50 or 60% casualties to close with American lines and engage in brutal close-quarters fighting. What they hadn't planned for was Chen's triple-barrel M2. The weapon opened fire when the assault wave reached the 150-yard mark, close enough that the converging barrel alignment created maximum concentration of fire. Chen, sighting through a scope jury-rig from a damaged rifle, pressed the main trigger and held it down. All three M2s fired simultaneously, the combined recoil driving the mount backwards several inches despite the sandbag reinforcement. The three streams of .50 caliber bullets intersected approximately 100 yards downrange, creating a zone roughly 30 feet wide and 6 feet high in which the density of fire was so extreme that nothing organic could survive. The first rank of Japanese soldiers ran directly into the zone and disintegrated. There is no other word that adequately describes what happened. Bodies were torn apart by multiple impacts, limbs severed, torsos opened, skulls shattered. Men didn't fall wounded. They simply ceased to exist as functional organisms, dropping in tangled heaps that created obstacles for soldiers behind them. Chen traversed the weapon slowly left, the three streams of fire sweeping across the charging line like a scythe through grain. The attackers, committed to the assault and unable to retreat or take cover in the open ground, had no choice but to continue forward or die where they stood. Most died running, cut down in groups of 5 and 10 as the traversing fire found them. The assault wave, which had been a disciplined formation 30 seconds earlier, broke apart into scattered groups of panicked men trying desperately to find any depression or shell crater that might offer protection. Lieutenant Yamada, leading the second wave, had been trained to continue the assault even if the first wave was destroyed. That was doctrine, based on the understanding that American machine guns would need to reload, or that the gunners would be suppressed by mortar fire, or that sheer momentum would carry some percentage of attackers through. But the gun that was killing his men wasn't behaving like any machine gun he'd encountered. It wasn't firing in bursts. It wasn't pausing. It was a continuous roar that didn't stop, and the fire was so dense that it looked like a solid wall rather than individual bullets. Yamada made the decision that probably saved his life and the lives of the 80 men in his wave. He ordered them down into whatever cover they could find and to wait. If the gun stopped, if it overheated or ran out of ammunition or was knocked out by return fire, they would continue the assault. Until then, advancing was suicide. The decision violated his orders and potentially dishonored him, but Yamada was a veteran who had survived 6 years of war by knowing when to push and when to preserve his force. He and his men pressed themselves into the mud and watched as the first wave died. Chen's crew kept the weapon firing for 42 seconds, cycling through 3 100-round belts and par forth before Chen released the trigger. The barrels were glowing visibly in the darkness, red hot from the sustained fire. The assistant gunners, 3 Marines who'd volunteered for the crew, were working frantically to clear a jam in the left side feed, while a 4th Marine dragged fresh ammunition belts forward from the reserve stockpile. The mount had held, though several welds were showing stress cracks and the recoil had driven the entire assembly backward nearly 2 feet, forcing the crew to reposition it. In front of the gun, the killing field was carpeted with bodies, easily 150 men dead, or dying in an area the size of a football field. The attack had been stopped completely, broken by a concentration of fire that no infantry assault could overcome. But Chen knew the Japanese would come again. They always did. His crew had approximately 3 minutes to replace the overheated barrels, clear the jam, reposition the mount, and prepare for the second wave. They worked with the efficiency of men who knew their lives depended on speed. Hands moving in practice sequences despite the darkness and the acrid smoke that hung over position. The second attack wave began at 0352 hours. The survivors of Yamada's group joined by a third wave that had been held in reserve. Approximately 180 men, advancing more cautiously now, using the bodies of the first wave as cover, firing rifles as they came. Chen's weapon was ready, fitted with 3 fresh barrels and loaded with new belts. This time Chen fired in bursts, 3-second pulls on the trigger separated by 2-second pauses to manage heat and give his crew time to monitor for jams. The effect was still devastating. Each burst emptied approximately 75 rounds from each barrel, 225 rounds total in 3 seconds, sweeping across the advancing line and dropping men in clusters. The pauses gave survivors moments to advance, but the next burst would find them and they would fall. The Japanese force tried to spread out, to present a wider front that couldn't be covered by a single weapon, but the triple-barrel M2's field of fire was so wide and the crew's ability to traverse so quick that dispersion didn't help. Men died alone or in groups, but they died regardless. By 03:59 hours, the second assault had broken, survivors retreating back into the jungle, dragging wounded when they could and abandoning them when they couldn't. Lieutenant Yamada survived the retreat, one of perhaps 60 men from the 2 assault waves who made it back to Japanese lines. He reported to his battalion commander, Colonel Matsuda, describing what he'd witnessed. The colonel didn't believe him at first. 3 machine guns in one position, synchronized to fire together, was one possibility. But Yamada insisted that the fire had come from a single point, that the tracers had originated from one location, and that the weapon had traversed as a unit, all 3 streams moving together. Other survivors confirmed this, their descriptions consistent despite the chaos and darkness. Japanese intelligence officers were called in, and they listened to the accounts with growing concern. The Americans had deployed something new, a weapon system that multiplied the effectiveness of their already formidable heavy machine guns. If this was being used elsewhere, if it was standard equipment rather than a one-off improvisation, Japanese assault tactics would need to be completely reconsidered. The name the survivors used for the weapon varied, but the most common phrase was Sama no Oni, 3 demons, a reference to the 3 streams of fire that seemed to hunt independently but kill together. Chen's weapon became famous within the battalion overnight. By dawn on November 8th, every officer in the regiment knew about it, and by noon the story had reached division headquarters. Requests came down the chain for technical details, photographs, operational reports. Chen was interviewed by intelligence officers, ordnance specialists, and a Marine Corps historian who wanted to document the innovation for future reference. The weapon itself was examined by engineers who took measurements, studied the mounting frame, and tested the synchronization mechanism. The consensus was that the design was brilliant in its simplicity, but too specialized for mass production. It required 3 complete M2S, which meant reducing the number of available weapons elsewhere. It consumed ammunition at a rate that was difficult to sustain logistically, and it required a skilled crew in a prepared position, factors that limited its tactical flexibility. But as a defensive weapon for a critical position expected to face mass assault, it was extraordinarily effective. Division authorized the construction of 2 additional triple-barrel units, using damaged or captured M2S where possible, and deployed them to companies holding exposed sectors of the perimeter. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was profound and immediate. Survivors of the November 8th assault spread stories about the 3 demons' gun, descriptions that grew more dramatic with each retelling. Some claimed the weapon could fire continuously for minutes without stopping, that its barrels never overheated, that it could cut down entire companies in seconds. These exaggerations had a basis in truth, but the reality was frightening enough without embellishment. Japanese commanders, already struggling with ammunition shortages and declining troop quality as veteran soldiers were killed and replaced with less trained conscripts, now had to factor in the possibility that any American position might be defended by this new weapon system. The tactical impact was a shift away from mass assault towards smaller, more dispersed attacks, infiltration tactics, and night raids designed to bypass machine gun positions rather than assault them directly. This played to American strengths, as smaller Japanese groups were easier to isolate and destroy with superior firepower and communication. The triple-barrel M2, used in only 3 engagements on Bougainville, influenced Japanese tactics across the entire theater simply through its reputation. The weapon saw action twice more before the campaign ended. On November 15th, Chen's crew used it to break up a night attack on a supply dump, killing an estimated 70 attackers and wounding dozens more. On November 23rd, one of the other triple-barrel units was employed during a Japanese counterattack near Hill 600, firing for nearly 2 minutes continuously and stopping an assault by approximately 150 men. Both engagements followed the same pattern. Japanese forces advancing into the weapon's field of fire, catastrophic casualties in the first seconds, and the assault breaking apart as survivors realized they couldn't overcome the concentration of fire. After the November 23rd engagement, Japanese forces on Bougainville ceased large-scale daylight or open ground assaults, reverting to infiltration and ambush tactics that avoided American strong points. The triple-barrel M2 had effectively rendered massed infantry assault obsolete in that theater, at least against prepared positions. Chen was promoted to Master Sergeant and received a commendation for his innovation, though the details remained classified during the war. The weapon itself was dismantled in December 1943 after the Bougainville campaign concluded. The component M2S returned to standard service. The two other triple-barrel units were similarly broken down, the parts redistributed. There was discussion at division level about standardizing the design and producing it in larger numbers, but logistical realities and the rapid pace of the Pacific War made this impractical. By early 1944, American forces were using tanks, flamethrowers, and naval gunfire to support infantry assaults, reducing the need for super-heavy machine guns in defensive roles. The tactical situation was also changing, with American forces increasingly on the offensive and Japanese forces defending from fortified positions rather than launching banzai charges. The niche that the triple-barrel M2 had filled on Bougainville, stopping mass assaults on static defensive lines, was becoming less common, but the concept didn't disappear entirely. Engineers at Army Ordnance facilities studied the design and incorporated lessons from it into later weapon systems. The idea of concentrating multiple weapons into a single firing unit influenced the development of multi-barrel systems, like the M45 quad mount, which mounted 4.50 caliber machine guns on a single turret for anti-aircraft defense. The principle of synchronized fire was applied to aircraft weapons, with fighter planes mounting multiple guns that fired in unison to concentrate fire on target aircraft. The Vietnam War saw experimentation with mini-gun systems that used rotating barrels to achieve extremely high rates of fire, weapons like the M134 that could fire thousands of rounds per minute. These were technological descendants of Chen's improvised triple-barrel M2, different in mechanism but similar in concept. Multiply firepower through multiple barrels controlled by a single operator. The Japanese soldiers who faced the Three Demons gun carried their memories and trauma for the rest of their lives. Lieutenant Yamada survived the war, returned to Japan, and worked as a teacher in Osaka until his death in 1987. In interviews conducted in the 1970s as part of an oral history project, he described the November 8th assault as the most terrifying experience of his 6 years of combat. "We had faced American machine guns many times," he said. "We knew how to attack them, how to use terrain and speed and numbers to get through. But this weapon was different. It didn't fire like a gun. It fired like a wall, a solid wall of bullets that moved and followed you. Men would run left or right, trying to avoid it, and the wall would move with them. There was no safe direction. You could only lie flat and pray, and even then you saw the ground around you torn up by bullets. I thought it was 3 guns at first, 3 gunners working together, but the fire was too synchronized, too perfect. It was 1 gun with 3 mouths, 3 demons that hunted together. I have never forgotten the sound. Sometimes I still hear it, in dreams. That roaring sound, like thunder that doesn't stop." American accounts of the weapon's effectiveness were more clinical, but equally striking. Captain Thornton's after-action report, filed on November 10, 1943, noted that the triple-barrel M2 had expended approximately 3,200 rounds during 3 engagements, resulting in an estimated 290 enemy casualties, and the breaking of 3 separate assault waves. The weapon's psychological impact appears to equal or exceed its physical effectiveness, Thornton wrote. Enemy forces exposed to its fire have subsequently avoided assaults on this sector, even when tactical considerations might warrant such action. Recommend further development and deployment in defensive scenarios where mass assault is anticipated. The report was forwarded up the chain of command, eventually reaching the desk of Marine Corps Commandant Lieutenant General Thomas Holcomb, who noted in a margin comment that improvised solutions by NCOs in the field continue to demonstrate greater tactical innovation than systems developed through formal channels. Robert Chen survived the war and remained in the Marine Corps, retiring as a sergeant major in 1958 after 20 years of service. He rarely spoke about the triple-barrel M2, considering it just one of many improvisations he'd made during the war, no more significant than a dozen other repairs and modifications. In a 1983 interview for a Marine Corps oral history project, Chen was asked if he'd been surprised by the weapon's effectiveness. "Not really," he said. "The math was simple. 3 guns firing at the same target put 3 times as many bullets into the same space at the same time. The M2 was already a proven weapon. I just multiplied it. The surprising part was how much it scared the Japanese. I'd expected it to kill a lot of them, which it did. But the panic, the way they stopped attacking our sector entirely, that was unexpected. They'd been willing to die in previous assaults. This weapon made them unwilling to even try. That's a different kind of effect, psychological instead of just physical." When asked if he felt proud of the innovation, Chen paused before answering. "Proud isn't the right word. I did what I needed to do to keep my Marines alive. The weapon accomplished that. But it killed a lot of men in terrible ways, cut them apart at close range. I'm glad it worked. I'm glad my people survived. But I don't celebrate it." The ethical dimension of weapons innovation in warfare remains contested and uncomfortable. Chen's triple-barrel M2 was extraordinarily lethal, designed specifically to maximize casualties against attacking forces. It succeeded in that purpose, killing hundreds of Japanese soldiers and preventing them from overrunning American positions. From a military standpoint, it was a successful innovation that saved American lives by taking enemy lives more efficiently. But the manner of killing, the sheer destructive power of concentrated .50 caliber fire tearing through human bodies, raises questions about the nature of warfare and the limits, if any, on what weapons should be employed. International law, codified in treaties like the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions, prohibits weapons designed to cause unnecessary suffering, but defines unnecessary in ways that are subject to interpretation. The triple-barrel M2 killed quickly and efficiently, causing no more suffering than any other machine gun, just more deaths in less time. Yet there's something viscerally disturbing about a weapon designed to multiply killing power by a factor of 3, to create a concentration of fire so dense that survival becomes impossible. These contradictions are inherent in warfare, where the objective is to kill enemy soldiers while adhering to laws and norms that attempt to limit how that killing is done. The Japanese soldiers who called the weapon 3 demons were engaging in a form of psychological processing, attributing supernatural qualities to something that was actually mechanical and rational, but exceeded their experience and expectation. This is a common response to new weapons technology throughout history. Medieval soldiers described early firearms as devil's tools. Indigenous peoples encountering European guns for the first time often interpreted them as magic or divine punishment. The psychological impact of weapons is as important as their physical effects, perhaps more so in cases where the weapon's reputation causes enemies to alter tactics or avoid engagement entirely. Chen's triple-barrel M2 achieved this, becoming feared beyond its actual capabilities, influencing Japanese behavior across Bougainville despite being deployed in only a handful of positions. The power of the weapon lay partly in its mechanics and partly in the stories told about it, stories that grew in the telling and created a legend larger than the reality. The reality was this: a Marine gunnery sergeant, faced with an impossible defensive assignment, built a weapon from scrap parts and ingenuity that could put 1,500 rounds per minute into a kill zone 30 feet wide. He and his crew used that weapon to kill approximately 200 enemy soldiers in less than 5 minutes of total firing time across 3 engagements. The weapon influenced enemy tactics, contributed to the successful defense of American positions, and demonstrated that field improvisation could sometimes outperform official weapons development. It was dismantled after the campaign, its parts returned to service, its design filed away in reports that most people would never read. The men who built it, operated it, and survived because it went home after the war and lived quiet lives, carrying memories they couldn't fully explain to people who hadn't been there. And the men who faced it, who survived the 3 demons and told their comrades about the wall of fire that couldn't be crossed, they carried different memories of terror and helplessness and the sound of a weapon that roared like nothing human. War drives innovation in directions that peace never would. Necessity, fear, and survival instinct push human ingenuity toward solutions that are effective, brutal, and often frightening in their efficiency. The triple barrel M2 was one of thousands of improvisations and innovations that emerged from World War II, most of them forgotten, documented only in after-action reports and fading veteran memories. But it deserves remembering, not for glorification but for understanding. It shows what humans can create when the stakes are absolute, when the choice is between innovation and death, when a skilled mechanic with access to spare parts can build something that changes the outcome of battles. It shows the multiplying power of force, how taking a proven weapon and tripling its output creates effects that are more than arithmetic, that cross threshold from effective to overwhelming. And it shows the cost, measured in bodies and trauma and psychological scars, of weapons that work exactly as designed. The Three Demons existed for 3 weeks in late 1943 on an island most people have never heard of, killed hundreds of men, saved hundreds of others, and then disappeared into history. Its story is small in the vast chronicle of World War II, but it's real, documented, and true, and it reveals something about human nature, about war, and about the terrible creativity that emerges when survival depends on being better at killing than the enemy. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below and subscribe for more stories like this.